Hi, I'm Aaron. Welcome to Renew Psychology Review. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about goals, specifically categories that goals can fall into: approach goals and avoidance goals. These are two really basic categories that a lot of research over the last 50 years has found that this is really hardwired into us. It's evolutionarily ancient. Structures deep in the brain deal with it. So the fact that this is so baked into our experience at such a fundamental level, I think makes it really useful as a set of categories to break down what we're doing, what we're trying to get out of our lives, and to think in a little bit more detail, more deliberately, what am I doing? Is this working for me? So I'll talk a little bit about the evolutionary history and biology of this here. Usually those aren't going to be the topics of this channel because I think they're not quite as, to me, some people would probably disagree, but to me they're not quite as actionable as things that deal more with the subjective sense or an everyday sense of what is it like to be experiencing this stuff in my life. We'll talk about that too, but just in this case, this is such a foundational thing. I think it's kind of nice to see. Well, it's maybe a little bit liberating to see. Okay, this is just how it is. So the evolutionary history of it, this comes up in animals that we broke off from 500 million years ago. So in biology, there's this idea of model organisms where a handful of, let's say, you hear about studies on rats or fruit flies. Rats and fruit flies are both model organisms that are used for different purposes. They reproduce quickly, they're easy to work with experimentally. There are experimental paradigms that have already been brought up around them to show certain things. Fruit flies about reproductive behavior would be a big one. Rats, since they're mammals, they're a little bit more like us, and so they can be used in behavioral experiments that are supposed to model things like depression or trauma or attachment to important people in our lives. Rats have attachments. They care about each other, right? They have other rats that they go to for comfort. So those would be examples of model organisms. Anyway, the reason I bring that up is that there's a model organism for approach and avoidance behavior, or it's used for that among other things. It's a flatworm, C. elegans. Our evolutionary history diverged from these flatworms. I looked it up, and the number I found was 500 million years ago. So way further in the past than dinosaurs was the last time we had a common ancestor with these worms. They're very simple organisms. They have 302 neurons. So around the same order of magnitude of neurons in this worm as we have bones in our body. And these worms, they show approach and avoidance behavior. They will move away from heat. They will move towards things that remind them of food. Or, I think that's what they use. I'm not sure about the approach part of the model, but they do, they have to have an ability behaviorally to go towards or to go away from things. So this has been with us a long time. Adding to that, even in terms of the brain structures that deal with this, I found two studies. So one that shows that lampreys, these kind of disgusting boneless eels with these sucker mouths, they have a very similar brain structure to ours in terms of, I think it was the periaqueductal gray that deals with this. And then birds. So in birds, the morphology is different. This paper kind of described it as being sort of opened up and folded back on itself, but that ultimately, when you take that fold into account, their periaqueductal gray type of region, if I'm remembering the paper correctly. I'll post these in the comments. The birds basically have the same structure of this fundamental piece of them that has to do with these approach and avoidance behaviors. So pretty interesting, I think, to think that this has been with us a long time. And so in terms of what we can do with that, if you find yourself motivated towards a certain type of behavior or away from it, or what I think might be even more useful here is to think about what are situations I'm involved in where I'm not sure exactly what's motivating me one way or the other, but there are strong emotions about it. So there's a model that I'll talk about in another follow-up episode here about how emotions can flow out of having goals achieved or thwarted. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have strong emotions, those emotions are probably telling you something about underlying implicit goals that you might have within you. These things are often not conscious, and sometimes, in some ways of thinking, they can even more powerfully inform our behavior if we're not conscious of them. So I think using this framework as a tool to get a better handle on what's going on inside of me, what seems to be driving me one way or the other, that's a good way to get a little bit more of a sense of control and mastery in our lives, potentially. Something to think about. So approach and avoidance categories. An approach goal is something that I want to move towards. Pretty straightforward, right? So this would tend to be associated with emotions like desire, lust, greed. Can also be associated with engagement. So an example that I thought of, let's say you're watching a basketball game, and okay, so for me, the Blazers are down by 2. It's the fourth quarter, shot clock's running down, and they've got to make that shot. Okay, so there's a strong approach goal for me there, even though I'm not the one playing. I want those Blazers to make that shot. I want them to win that game so that I can get the emotional payoff of watching that and feeling like I'm on their side, they're on my side. So that would be an example of an approach goal where you can picture kind of you're watching a game like that and it focuses your attention in. So that focusing of attention in a positive way, a way that feels good, that can be characteristic of an approach goal. Although approach goals, they don't always feel good. There's some evidence that in some ways anger can be an approach goal. So anger can actually help us move towards something that we want to get, something that we haven't been able to. But there's some debate about that. Anyway, just, these are some of the emotions that might be associated with approach goals. Avoidance goals. So avoidance, pretty straightforward. It's the opposite. Avoidance is things that I want to get away from or avoid, associated with emotions like disgust, fear, maybe panic in extreme cases. So, and these emotions that I'm bringing up here, if you want an interesting body of work to look at, or actually YouTube videos, there's a guy, Yak Panksepp. One of the things that brought my attention to his work and to this whole area is my last video, Nancy McWilliams. I talked about her book, Psychoanalytic Diagnosis. So on the face of it, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic approaches would seem pretty removed from something as kind of behavioral and concrete as I have a goal and it's approach motivated or it's avoidance motivated, or both. But Nancy McWilliams, she references this guy, Yak Panksepp, who's a neuroscientist. She brings Panksepp's neuroscience into it to talk about, here are kind of some of the approach and avoidance goals that inform different personality styles, different characteristic ways of moving through the world. So maybe I'll find some links to dig up about that, but Yak Panksepp, really interesting guy. He is the one with his affective neuroscience is the word for it, affective with an A. He really broke down, here are some of the systems in mammals, the neurological circuits that have to do with those senses of like desire or greed or lust or thirst in mammals that would go with approach avoidance, or disgust, fear, panic that would go with avoidance. So, this can really tie together a lot of psychological theories. It's on the face of it, it's a very behaviorally flavored kind of thing. It has to do with how animals are behaving outwardly out there in the world. But then it can also tell you about the emotions that would come up in existential therapy or psychodynamic therapy or anything else. It's a fundamental part of who we are. So those are some kind of general ideas about it. How would you concretely apply this to your life? I have a few ideas. I'd like to put this out there. Part of my goal with putting the background out there is just to make this usable to you in a way where you can make it your own and find new and innovative things to do with it. But just some ideas of mine. So thinking about a situation, just try to call to mind some situation in your life where things aren't quite going the way that you want. Presumably this is a lot of what this is about, right? We want to live our lives better. And so you can think about getting more of the good in your life. You can also think about these sort of situations with more tension in them, things where there is some aversive emotion coming up. So if you think of one of those situations, can you backtrack from that to what are some possible approach goals that would figure into getting me into that situation or keeping me stuck there? Or when do I have an approach goal there that's getting thwarted maybe, and I'm not getting what I want out of that situation? The same way, you could think about, are there avoidance goals related to that situation? Is there something that I'm trying to get away from? Is it hard to get away from? Am I trying to get away from something that's just not going to be gotten away from? Or is there a conflict between approach and avoidance? Do I have both of those types of goals in that situation? And are they kind of pulling me in opposite directions? So when early psychodynamic writers wrote about conflicts, an inner conflict, that could be a sense of I have both of these goals pulling me in opposite directions. A lot of this was written about before this approach and avoidance research was done, but I think it probably does something to validate both approaches, that you could arrive at that same conclusion that this thing is structured in that way through these different approaches. So you could also think about, are there situations where I have too much of one, where I'm kind of too overwhelmed by a goal? So let's say, okay, so if you're having a hard time holding your attention steady on one thing that you really need to have done, is there a conflict between multiple approach goals? Do I feel too much approach towards one thing that's not actually the thing that I'm doing right now? Or is there not enough? What's it like to not really have any approach or avoidance goals in a situation? I don't know for sure. I haven't seen specific research on this, but I could imagine maybe that could look like boredom or sort of listlessness or drifting through life. So a friend of mine has been really into movies by the Duplass brothers recently. So Paddleton is one of these. Let's see, I can't remember any others off the top of my head. It's kind of connected to like the mumblecore movie movement. Francis Ha was another one that came up kind of around the same thing. Anyway, the reason I bring them up is that these movies have a lot of characters that they are kind of drifting through life, or, you know, maybe they have their place in life, but it's just kind of blah. And it's kind of about, you know, funny situations that come up, just about them not being super engaged or just sort of being their goofy selves without really a strong motivation to be otherwise, right? So maybe those movies have kind of a characteristic of a lack of approach and avoidance motivation working together. So just unmotivated kind of states. So yeah, these are some ideas about how approach and avoidance motivation could come out in life. This is going to be a foundational video that I'll probably reference in others as I'm talking about sort of more elaborate and detailed theories, theories that are kind of closer to explaining social situations in our lives, the context that we live in. Yeah, more to the purpose of this channel. This is a foundational video, and so I hope that the topics come across pretty clearly and maybe give you some ideas for different directions to go with it. Thanks for watching, and if you found this video useful, please like, subscribe, and give me a comment. Let me know what you think. Thanks.